Welcome to the Disgruntled Millennial Podcast. My name is Brett Siegel, the Disgruntled Millennial, broadcasting to you from my safe space down here in northern Florida, where I'm always free from your bigotry, racism, hatred, microaggressions, and patriarchy. Don't forget to stick it to feminists by liking our Facebook page, The Disgruntled Millennial. Naturally, Facebook hates what we do over here at The Disgruntled Millennial. Well, because we like freedom, and we're not afraid to talk about it. So if you like what we do, help us bypass Facebook's anti-American, Sharia law-obsessed, tyrannical algorithms and share. Don't forget to subscribe to The Disgruntled Millennial on iTunes or Podbean, and also visit our website at dmpodcast.com, dmpodcast.com. And if you really love America, go to our iTunes and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out. We now take you into a senatorial powwow with Elizabeth Warren. Chief Spreading Bull, when the white man came to our village, he brought the light with no flame. He brought the carriage with no horse. He brought the machines that fill with gold. Our great-great-great-grandchildren will enjoy this abundance. They will breed like a herd of mating buffalo. Should we not accept the white man and forgive him for his grandfather's crimes? No! They took you out of your teepees and gave you Western-style housing. You have a cultural right as diverse Native Americans to live according to your rich history of scalping, pillaging, and raping other tribes. But Chief Spreading Bull, we live like the gods. We feast like the hyena on a full moon. Our sicknesses vanish like the water moccasin in the river. We are at peace with our fellow tribes. Why must we hate the white man? No! I teach at Harvard. That means that white supremacy is real and that you don't know what you're talking about because you're a buffoon. Do you teach at Harvard? But Chief Spreading Bull, if you hate the white man, why do you participate in his traditions? No! Don't you get it? I'm using the white man's system in order to bring down the white man. Believe me, our Native American culture will rise once more. We will live in teepees again. Kill Whitey! But Chief Spreading Bull, teepees suck. No! Greetings and salutations. You are tuning in to the Disgruntled Millennial Podcast. My name is Brett Siegel, where I always broadcast to you, not live, from my safe space down here in northern Florida, where I'm always free from your bigotry, racism, hatred, microaggressions, and patriarchy. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the situation on the ground in South Africa. It is a perfect example of how intersectional politics has come to fruition. The religion of intersectionality is taught heavily in South Africa schools, especially to the black population. Intersectionality, for those of you who don't know, is basically identity politics on steroids. It's the idea that we have to divide society by victim classes, with cisgendered straight white men as the ultimate oppressors, and everyone else resides underneath them. It doesn't matter how much you earn or how much genuine political power you retain. According to intersectionality, a white schizophrenic homeless man has more power than Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey, simply because of the color of his skin. Now, unlike America, the alleged supremacist race in South Africa is a minority. The blacks are the majority in South Africa. But how? How, you ask, could leftist ideologies propagate themselves in a place that turns the white supremacist narrative on its head? For example, the exploding black population in South Africa, or anywhere else for that matter, would lead any reasonable person to believe that there is no such thing as white supremacy in South Africa, or that white supremacy is actually a good thing, okay? You know, I mean, a genocide is supposed to decrease the population, not increase the population. Today we are here with Simon Roche. He's going to help us get to the bottom of this. He is the head of the office of the headquarters of the world's largest non-state civil defense organization, Suidlanders, or spelled S-U-I-D, Landers of South Africa, Suidlanders of South Africa. He was once an ANC, African National Congress activist, and now he works tirelessly to prepare for an impending race war in South Africa, an event which is seeming more and more likely by the day. Racism and oppression are byproducts of unchecked leftism, and although most of the Dixiecrat safe space dwelling friends might disagree, there is a certain situation going on the ground in South Africa that is sort of harrowing right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Welcome to the show, Simon Roche.
Thank you very much, Brett. Thanks for having us again.
Let's talk a little bit about the language of white supremacy, the language of white guilt, white privilege, institutional power structures, and how that's relating to what's going on in South Africa right now. I mean, there's something urgent going on in South Africa right now. Let's talk a little bit about the main thing that everyone's talking about, which is the appropriation without compensation of white farmlands.
Yes, it's quite a big thing. We have a new national president, and he has generally been perceived by white people to be what blacks in South Africa call a coconut. A coconut in black parlance means a black person who's brown on the outside but white on the inside. So it's a derogatory term. Mm-hmm. And whites have always kind of fancied this new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, to be a really urbane, sophisticated, well-spoken, elegant, industrious, kind of, almost the Protestant stereotype type of character. And I can tell you that at Nelson Mandela's funeral, I might have mentioned to you previously, I was appointed the project manager of Nelson Mandela's funeral 5 years before he passed away, almost to the day, by coincidence. Wow. And in the end, I never managed that funeral. I turned it down just before he passed away because I'd had some kind of a repentance in my heart. But I took advantage of an opportunity to go there. And at the funeral, I passed some comment about this guy, Cyril Ramaphosa, and the reply I got from a senior ANC person was, "You whites don't have a clue. You think Cyril Ramaphosa is a coconut, but he is an ANC dog on an ANC leash. And you will see. Anyway, so he's just come into power a month ago, and the first thing he did was facilitate a parliamentary motion. It wasn't brought by him, but he was acquiescent to expropriate all white-owned property, not necessarily only land, property without compensation." So I think that kind of answers your question very thoroughly, and needless to say, people are panic-stricken.
Right. So since apartheid was dismantled, this has been sort of a fervor among, sort of a groundswell among South Africans, where that this has been talked about, but not really put into any sort of meaningful implementation. Now, what does the South African Constitution have to say about this? Because there's a lot of folks going around saying that, well, this is totally constitutional. All it would take is a little bit of tweaking of the Constitution. And then it's just a perfectly good and normal thing to do. Like, for example, here we have eminent domain, which basically says that the government, for certain purposes, not racism, but for certain purposes, the government can come in and give you a just compensation. But if the government needs the land, it can come in and basically take the land, but it has to compensate you. There's something similar. Yeah. There's something similar in the South African Constitution, but the proponents of this appropriation without compensation, they're trying to basically to do an end run around that stipulation that says that you can take land, but you have to compensate the people who you're taking the land from.
Yeah, well, to give you a sense of context, there are about 45,000 commercial farms in South Africa, probably less, but let's be conservative. And those commercial farms are run by about 33,000 farmers, probably less, but let's be conservative. And up until now, the government has pursued a policy of willing buyer, willing seller, which is to say that under Section 25 of our Constitution, private property is sacrosanct. However, if a black tribe or clan goes to the government and says, look, 100 years ago, we occupied that property over there, and then Simon's grandfather came along and knocked our grandfather over the head and stole the land, and we'd really like it back. the government then approaches the farmer or farmers concerned and offers them money for the farms. And that has been a fairly successful thing from the one point of view. But this is the huge irony of this, excuse my language, bullshit story, this communist bullshit story. 92.7%, as revealed recently by Dr. Anthea Jeffrey of the Institute of Race Relations, 92.7% of the successful claims where the adjudicator says, yes, you can have that land and we're going to buy it from the white guy. In 92.7% of cases, the successful applicants do not take the land. They say, give us the money instead. So it's not really about the land. It's not really about the African soil and the African soul and the African heart and the African this and the African that. That's a bullshit story. To give you another example, bearing in mind that I've told you that we have something less than 45,000 commercial farms in South Africa. It has recently been revealed by the Rolf Meyer Institute that 4,323 farms, which have been successfully claimed by black people, have not been occupied because, in fact, there are internal disputes within those groups of people saying, actually, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so should never have been a part of this process in the first place. And it just reveals to you what a fiction, what a fallacy, what a nonsense this process is by and large. So now the government has said, notwithstanding this successful willing buyer, willing seller model, they've now said, well, we're going to take white-owned land and give it to blacks regardless. Right. And that is causing a great deal of distress. There are many people in South Africa who are extremely anxious. And the knock-on effect, I've been trying to explain this to white people here in South Africa, that what we should be paying attention to, and I've been saying this for over a month, since prior to this guy's election, what we should be concerned about is not just the taking of the land, which may happen in months and years to come, but it will give a license to ne'er-do-wells, to bad people, to revolutionaries, to radicalized youth, to disaffected, unemployed, hopeless, helpless, and lost people, to attack the white farms. As you know, we have a massive problem with farm murders. Now, last year, in 2017, between the 1st of January and the 28th of February, or the 29th, if it was a leap year, the number of farm attacks over that period was quite low. It was about 20. The number of farm attacks this year over the same period is 102. And so what I've been saying has been proven right. And it's not necessarily credit to me. I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet. I'm trying to make the point that people who don't examine these matters miss the vital aspects of them. And the simple reality is that we've had an explosion of farm murders and farm attacks this year because these black people feel as if they've been given a license. Well, the big man, the big president says he's going to take these bad whites' land away. So, golly gee, they must be bad, and we can kill them if we want to. So it's a very severe thing, a 500% increase in the number of farm attacks and farm murders, and they are being committed with the utmost cruelty. I won't speak for very much longer, but if you're interested, I can give you some examples of the vicious brutality that has been employed in these murders.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want those statistics. And I also want to make the point that as the rhetoric, as this intersectional white supremacist, white guilt, white privilege rhetoric amps up, the murders and the attacks, they are also ramping up. People are feeling more and more emboldened to go around and attack white people, white farmers, with impunity. And it just goes to show you what you were saying before, that the fact that, that the Constitution already has stipulations that will help people who are disaffected by apartheid, will help them get back on their feet. But it's got to be something that's a unified joint thing so that everybody eventually succeeds in the end. But it seems that the motivations for this has nothing to do with peace or equality or anything like that. It has more to do with revenge, and what better to propagate a vengeful attitude than this idea that all white people, whether they're the majority or the minority, are just going around oppressing people, are just going around oppressing random people. And let's talk a little bit about some of those statistics about the attacks on white farmers.
Well, I can give you a number of examples. One elderly gentleman was trussed up, put into his Ford pickup truck, and the truck was locked, and then it was set alight.
Oh, my God.
Now, that clearly has got nothing whatsoever to do with a land grievance. In another case, a elderly couple were trussed up. They were tied to chairs, kind of like in the movies, and it so happens apparently the crooks themselves didn't do this. There was already a pot of boiling water and a separate pot of oil on the stove, and they poured the boiling water and boiling oil over this old man and old lady. They were in their 70s, if I'm not mistaken. In another case, a woman was tied to a chair. She was 60 years old. I've come across people speaking about 70, 80 years old. That's not correct. She was 60 years old, and she was tied to a chair, and they took a Black & Decker drilling machine, and they drilled her through her 2 ankles, then through her 2 knees, then through her 2 hips, then through her 2 wrists, and so on, up to her shoulders, and she died in the course of that.
That's torture. I mean, this is not like a peaceful appropriation of land where, like eminent domain. Imagine eminent domain here in America, where the government or some wild mob just came in and just took and just started drilling holes into people's heads under the guise, for the sake of equality and for reparations and for to righting some sort of cosmic wrong. That's how to do it, folks.
And to give you a sense of context, or your listeners a sense of context here, Brett, just to be absolutely clear, excluding the traditional lands held by black people during apartheid, black people had millions and millions and millions of hectares, or acres, you would say, in North America, of land. It's not that they had no land. Now, if you leave aside those which are known as tribal trusts, for example, the Zulu King's Tribal Trust is 1.8 million hectares. That would be 2 times 2.5 is just short of 5 million acres, is the Tribal Trust of the Zulu King, the Ingonyama Trust, right? Mm-hmm. Aside from that, black people own 26% of the land in South Africa. So it's not like they have nothing. We're talking now about commercial farmland, not houses, not gardens, in which case it would be a far higher percentage. In 2 provinces, namely the province of KwaZulu-Natal and the province of the Eastern Cape, black people own 49% of the land. So if anybody's kind of thinking here, well, shame the poor guys, okay, they shouldn't drill holes in people, but dear me, no. The argument has been couched in such misleading terms that there's this conception that blacks have absolutely nothing and whites have absolutely everything, and it's far from the truth.
Right. Well, that's the language of white supremacy. That's the language of intersectionality that's just seeping in to lots of different cultures around the world. It's happening in Europe. It's happening here. It's happening in South Africa, obviously, that no matter what the actual situation is, I mean, the blacks could own a majority of the land and still they would find a way to make it seem like they were under white oppression. It's that language which, first of all, it doesn't jive with reality. White supremacy in any decently run white supremacist nation, blacks would not have the opportunities to even even talk about taking land away from the white people. They wouldn't even have any of these opportunities because a decently run oppressive society squelches that kind of pushback pretty immediately. So I mean, just on the face of it, you can deduce without actually knowing any of the real specifics about what's going on that this whole white supremacist narrative is just a bunch of hogwash, and it's just a reason for these folks to come in and basically act like barbarians. I'm sorry, but that's really what it is. It's just an excuse for these folks to come in and take revenge on somebody else's father, on somebody else, on crimes that somebody else committed. And that is one of those that we call racism. I mean, there's this whole thing going on. Reverse racism. You got racism, and then there's reverse racism. No, reverse racism is racism.
Would you believe me if I told you that the number of white people killed in the past 24 years of democracy, killed by black people, is more than double the maximum number that can be found? In other words, according to the most liberal source, more than double the maximum number that anybody has ever contended of blacks killed by whites during the entire 40 years of apartheid. That gives you some indication. Well, it substantiates your allegation that this is really just about revenge. It's about brutality. It's about cruelty and nastiness and common crime than anything else. Apartheid was supposedly so bad, which I have always never been an apartheid supporter. That's why I was an African National Congress activist. So don't mistake the terms that I'm using. But apartheid was supposedly so bad. If so, then how bad is the new South African rainbow nation?
Right. And this is one of those things that intersectionality and intersectional feminism does to the mind. It allows you to say, okay, well, this one form of oppression is bad, but this other form of oppression is good. If you even Google, if you even Wikipedia the words white supremacy and black supremacy, there's a completely different definition for both. For white supremacy, for white supremacy, it says that it's about racism, about oppressing blacks, right? And then when you go over to black supremacy, it's a response to white supremacy. When in fact, we know that folks like Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan and a bunch of other folks out there, you see it coming to fruition in Hollywood now with the new movie Black Panther coming out that, that black supremacy is not really a thing. And if you could convince people that black supremacy is not really a thing, that it's merely in response to white racism, then you can basically justify doing anything. If you literally think that this white person is the object of is actually oppressing you in some way, shape, or form, even though you don't know this person from Adam, if you can convince yourself that this person is oppressing you, well, then you can justify taking any kind of action on him to stop that oppression. And that's where intersectionality comes in, is because it makes these racial differences. They say that racism prejudice plus power equals racism. Black people don't have the power. Well, then they can't really truly be racist. Therefore, the things that they're doing, the retaliations, so they say, the retaliations on white people, there's no, they're justified in them because they're just responding to white racism.
Well, even that is fictional poppycock, because I remember when I was at university studying sociology, which is just about the most left-wing of the conventional. I'm not talking about the modern courses that you can do, toenail cutting and all of this nonsense. Of the conventional humanities, sociology is just about the most left-wing possible. In fact, it certainly is. And I remember then being told by communist lecturers that racism is the prejudicial judgment of another race based on a preconception. So it's basically prejudice to say, if this person is black, they have the following characteristics and character traits, generally speaking. And their angle was, look, there are no genetic differences between black and white people and between everybody, but let's just simplify it for a second, because as Margaret Mead proved in the South Pacific, in fact, just as there are no gender differences except physical a womb versus a penis and breasts and so on. In fact, men and women have the identical temperament, except that it has been skewed by false social constructs. Right. Similarly, black people they have curly hair, which is pretty reliably very black, and they have dark toned skins and perhaps puffier lips and all of this kind of stuff, bigger penises or whatever these things are. But those differences are only physical, and indeed those entire physical differences in blood and other things do not include the brain. So the entire physical is different between blacks and whites, except the brain was left out of that picture. And therefore, a black person is identical in behavior, in inclinations, in temperament, in everything except physical things, such as muscle, explosiveness, and center of gravity, and so on and so forth, is absolutely identical in temperament and what have you. So when you say a black person is like this, or black people are like that, or whatever the case may be, that is racism. Now that argument has been completely turned on its head and shoved down the toilet for the nonsense that it is, they've redefined it, the definition. The definition that you just gave. It's Brett, they will make up lies as many as they have to and for as long as they have to. They will never, ever, ever judge themselves by their own standards. Every time they fail, they'll bounce back with another piece of nonsense.
Right. It's a moving target. It's an Alinsky tactic that basically it sort of short circuits the mind. And you have leftists here in America who think that this land appropriation thing in South Africa is a great idea. People are going around calling white people colonizers now because of a joke that took place in that Black Panthers movie. But they think it's just this great old thing that white people are basically being tortured and kicked off their land. When, of course, they criticize Donald Trump for just a simple idea of building a wall because it might violate some sort of eminent domain practice here, just basically Donald Trump giving an old lady lots of money so that he could build a building or so that we could build a wall. That's bad. That's wrong. That's terrible. But when you bring it over to South Africa, the same exact thing, except with no compensation, but with racial motivations, that's just fine and dandy for some reason. Well, because of the person who is doing the perpetrating and the person who is the victim. The white people are the victims. The white people in South Africa are oppressors, no matter what their financial status is. They are oppressors because they're white. Therefore, it is justifiable to take their land away. And of course you have these movies, these propaganda movies like Black Panther, which basically postulate that had white people never colonized Africa in the first place, well, Africa would have its own space program. It would have its own big hospitals. They would have all the pharmaceuticals and all the medicine and all the running water and the skyscrapers and all that stuff. The evil, terrible, awful white man just came in several hundred years ago and basically stopped the African industrial revolution right in its tracks. Now, why is it? I mean, of course you can see how, just on face, it's sort of ridiculous. As we can see, the white population moved in, and all of a sudden you have huge hospitals, running water, you have all kinds of good stuff. And the more that these leftists sort of infiltrate the government and promote their leftist intersectional policies that are flat out racist towards the white people. Now you have all sorts of things like water shortages and food shortages, and there's all sorts of things going on where, it's like, what does a whiteless South Africa look like?
A whiteless South Africa looks like Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zaire, Congo, Central African Republic, Chad, Togo, Senegal. It looks like an absolute disaster.
And what would you say to the folks who say, well, that's just racist? You're just saying that because you are a white supremacist, Simon. You are just racist towards the black folks. How could you even say that?
There's nothing that I can say, because any argument that I advance is hypothetical. Only time will tell whether or not that is the case. Now, the way we would look at it is to say as follows. We've had a black government for 24 years in South Africa. And it's a shambles, an absolute shambles. Anybody who does a little bit of research will discover the massive amounts of corruption, 700 billion lost in a couple of years, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But of course, people will say, well, that's because of the reason, and you know, there's always some or other. Only time will tell whether or not black farmers and black engineers, black industrialists, black scientists, black physicists and mathematicians are able to generate the same standards of, for want of a better word, I'm not trying to be disparaging, I just can't think of a better word, the same standards of civilization that have been engendered by the whites in South Africa. Until that happens, who knows? So far, it's not looking good. So far, the new South African rainbow nation's putative, ostensible success is really just rhetoric. You know, our rate of growth has declined drastically. Our rate of unemployment has gone through the roof. We now have only we have a population of about 56 million people. We have 3.1 million taxpayers and 16.3 million people on social grants. That is the new South Africa. Whether you're a rabid, racist, Nazi, right-wing maniac, or whether you are a Fanonist, the most left-wing creature imaginable, it doesn't change the fact. We now have 3.1 million people paying tax and 16.3 million people on social grants. We have a crisis in our economy. Our currency, the rand, has been downgraded to just above junk status. Our sovereign bonds have been downgraded to junk status. The bonds of our major industries, such as our National Electricity Supply Commission, have been downgraded to junk. We are in an absolute crisis, and that is the product of a black Africanist, politically correct government that is so hidebound by doctrine that they would never in a million years let pragmatism or good practice have a say in their decisions. They just won't do it.
Let's talk a little bit about the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, because I think that's one of the things that, you know, that is one of the indicators, I think, of a crumbling society, is when just everything left and right is starting to be nationalized. We need the water. Let's nationalize the water. Let's not open it up to the free markets, to the vicissitudes of the free markets, which is ultimately what led to the Industrial Revolution in America and consequently all around the world. It's when you nationalize businesses. It's when you nationalize products and certain, factories and whatever it is that the government thinks that it needs to take control of. This is when societies start to crumble. And what we're seeing now, of course, with this intersectionality going on in colleges in South Africa, the land appropriation bill that's going on right now, the attacks on farmlands. Now we're appropriating the Reserve Bank. It seems like a perfect storm of just a situation that is going to lead inevitably to a collapse.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm of communist revolutionary mania. And as you say, there is now, the day before in our parliament, it was proposed that a team, a task team, a committee, whatever you want to call it, be put together to examine the nationalization of our Reserve Bank. So that will go ahead. It was very warmly received by the parties who have approximately, all told, almost 80% of the parliamentary seats. So there is no way that it cannot go through. So yeah, that's another one on the list. Now we're going to give our Reserve Bank is going to be given to a bunch of guys whose only interest is in the self. Me, myself, and I, right here, right now, everything all at once, which is what we've seen in the new South African Rainbow Nation, whether people like it or not. The amounts of involved in corruption are phenomenal. I mean, I can tell you, and I have hard evidence of this, I can show it to you. I can tell you of instances where in government budgets, in a budget of 199 million. Let me just get my figures correct here. 122 million. So well over, just about 60%, over 60%, is allocated for corruption, for payoffs, for bribes, for backhanders, for greasing of palms, call it whatever you like. Can you imagine living in a society in which the government spends only 40% of its revenue on the tasks for which that money is devoted?
Yeah, it sounds like what would have happened if Bernie Sanders had gotten elected or Hillary Clinton had gotten elected. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, and here's the thing. Most of these taxpayers are white. Is that not true?
Yes. It's about a 50-50 thing. As a proportion of the people, we are about 10 times. So when I say 50-50, about half the taxpayers are white, about half of them are not white. But bearing in mind that the white population is only 8.5% of the overall population, proportionately, we are 10 times more than the other three conventional racial groups in South Africa. We have black people, as these are the conventional racial groups that were used under apartheid and which are still used by the African National Congress government. Then we have Indian people from India who came as sugarcane workers almost 140 years ago. And then we have colored people, and they are mixed race people who refuse point blank, very stubbornly, to be described as black. So mixed race people in South Africa insist upon being called coloreds. And so of the four racial groups, the whites represent a disproportion of about a factor of 10 in the payment of tax. Yes.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of the big spender, the big earners here in America when Bernie Sanders wants to tax them 90%. Now, even with a absolutely fair tax rate, a fair flat tax rate where everyone was taxed exactly the same, the people who end up making more money, they're the ones paying for the roads, not you, not the average taxpayer. They're the ones paying for the big government projects. And yet still we have to, the leftists in America still call them, the 1%. We have to take down the 1%. Even if everyone is paying exactly the same, not like the sliding tax scale that the progressive tax brackets that liberals want. They want, poor people to pay nothing, and they want the rich people to pay absolutely everything. Even in a fair system, the people who are earning the most money are already paying more, and people in society get untold benefits from that tax money, assuming that the money isn't going into the pockets, into the pockets of corrupt politicians, assuming that the money is getting spent on what needs to be getting spent on. People who don't earn a lot of money are actually getting getting unearned value from the money taken from richer people just because at a flat rate. 10% of a $10 billion is hell of a lot more than 10% of $100,000.
Yes.
So it seems like it's the same kind of thing that's going on in there. Even though per capita, white people tend to pay more money, they're still not happy with with the white people. They have to take more. They have to take the land. They've got to fudge and massage the system so that more is taken away from these people who are allegedly oppressing all the black majority.
And Brett, this thing is it resembles a kind of a trajectory. If you imagine a kid or two kids playing with a ball in a garden, and the mother comes out and says, "If that ball hits the front window, I'm going to tan your behinds." And one of the kids throws the ball at some point, and it leaves his hand, and he thinks, "Oh dear, it might go skew." And he watches in kind of slow motion as that ball heads towards the window. And what we as Suidlanders are saying, and if we turn out to be wrong, great, then we're all going to live happily ever after, and my children are going to live safe and happy. So we're not advocating this, but we are saying that the trajectory of South Africa is by definition going to end in a collision that is a civil war. There's going to be a collision of sorts, and that's what we're preparing for. You know, we've just launched an urgent, desperate Free Starter campaign through Charles C. Johnson and the guys at Free Starter, formerly WeSearcher, because we feel as if a civil war, because of all of the things that you and I have been discussing, is very, very nearby. And if that's not enough to convince your listeners, let me give you some examples. On the 7th of November, 2016, the head of the Marxist Economic Freedom Fighters Party said to his supporters in the town of Newcastle that he's not calling for the slaughter of all whites yet. A prince regent of one of South Africa's most important tribes said to me, I know him very, very well, said to me, Simon, that could mean anything in English idiom. In Black African language idiom, that means only one thing. Prepare yourselves to kill these people.
Right.
About 5-6 months later, the African National Congress still possesses its private militia, the guys who planted the bombs, the terrorist activities, and what have you. Mkhonto Wesizwe, it means the spear of the nation. It still possesses Mkhonto Wesizwe. Mkhonto Wesizwe still exists, and the head of Mkhonto Wesizwe in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, which is our most populous province, it's where all the Zulu people are, said it is now time for blacks to make contact so that they can be sent to training camps to train to kill whites in a civil war. This is the head of Mkhonto Wesizwe in a province of 10 million people. Shortly after that, the head of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party, Julius Malema, the same guy as from the first anecdote, said it is now time for blacks to take the spear in hand for the taking of white-owned property. About 3 months ago, our judge president, Mogoeng, said that there is a potential for a civil war in South Africa. Things are very, very, very severe. The farm attacks, 102 farm attacks in the space of 60 days, 60 days, and so on and so forth. Everything that we've discussed, I don't have to regurgitate it, they are not just events happening over there, kind of isolated. They have ramifications and consequences and knock-ons like dominoes. And the simple reality is that the way things are going now, there is going to be a civil war in this country. And Suidlanders, as the largest civil defense organization in the world, is frantically preparing for that. We're in a state of great anxiety because we cannot see how it is avoidable.
Right. Well, one of the things that's going on here in America concerning what's happening in South Africa, well, because a lot of Americans here on both sides of the aisle see South Africa as sort of a canary in the coal mine. And, you know, the Black Panther movie coming out and everything, there's all this fervor about colonization, and now the new latest fad for leftists is to be going around calling white people colonizers. That's the new insult now. We're all colonizers. So what I did was I put a little clip of Julius
Malema.
Yeah, Julius Malema. I put a little clip of him basically saying that we're not, saying exactly that, saying to a stadium full of black folks, a crowd of angry, riled up black folks, basically saying to all these people, it's time to start thinking about white genocide, right? So I put this on my Facebook page, which is about 113 followers strong, a very, very diverse group. It's an open forum where people can come on and debate, and I don't censor free speech like Facebook likes to do. I don't kick off people who are, who say politically incorrect things, but people come on there, Americans, people from California, people from LA, coming on saying things like, finally, someone who is militant enough to fight back the white devil. And then I'll respond something like, well, white devil, that's pretty racist. You're going to be just like them. And it's so explicit. The response is things like, white people are evil. I'm sick of putting up, in the same sentence, white people are evil. I'm sick of putting up with all the racism in my day-to-day life. Think about it's like an oxymoron type of sentence. You're basically saying, I'm tired of the racism, and all white people are evil in the same exact sentence. So this is the kind of cognitive dissonance that's becoming absolutely normal here in America, and it's migrating this ideology, this mindset that is okay to oppress a certain group simply because you claim them to be colonizers or oppressors, that you hold them accountable for the sins of their parents, for the sins of their grandparents, for the sins of their great ancestors. That basically that is the essence of racism, is holding an individual accountable for the color of their skin, which is basically, for their lineage. And this rhetoric is amping up here in America, and it's getting a little bit scary because you have groups like Black Lives Matter destroying Baltimore. You have groups like Antifa stopping conservative speakers from speaking on campus. You've got leftists around trying to grab guns. You have leftists trying to silence people. Now, think about it. There is a perfect storm that is brewing over here too. You're not allowed to talk about it. If someone comes to your house, you're not allowed to defend yourself with a weapon. And according to the government, this intersectionality is the intersectional ideal sort of reigns true. So what recourse do folks who land on the other side of the aisle even have in the end if we don't constantly push back, if organizations like yours aren't constantly pushing back on these ideologies? What recourse would we have? I even asked a guy on my Facebook, I said, where do you expect white people to go? Europe is being inundated by refugees. Africa, they want, there are folks who, there's some guy just said to me the other day, white people have no claim to Africa. They should all just leave Africa. Some folks say, they should come to America, right? But folks in America also want white people to leave. They say we came and took it from the Native Americans. So where are white people supposed to go? Where are white people supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? Where are white people supposed to go in the end? Some people say Europe. But Europe isn't much friendlier towards white people now with all the influx of the refugees from all around the world. Refugees who say that they have a human right and they're entitled to be there, regardless of what.
But are they white, those refugees? Just as a point of order, can we be clear on this?
No, absolutely not.
They're not white. All right, now I know.
So in the end,
it's unbelievable.
In the end, there's this perfect storm that is brewing now, which is basically going to lead to something that is really, really reminiscent of a genocide. Because, and I know you're not supposed to say white genocide. You're not supposed to say it. It's just you're pandering to the alt-right when you say white genocide. But I mean, if you actually look at what is going on and you see what is happening, and if you're in a sort of a position like I am and some other commentators who actually see these little microcosms of people who are brazenly expressing their opinion about white people, the white devil. I had an interview recently with a girl from South Africa who basically told me that I should move out of my house and let a black man move in, but I still pay rent as a form of reparations. When I told her that, as a form of reparations for American slavery. Now, when I told her that my family was dealing with their own oppression during the time of slavery, that my family didn't come here, but to escape communism in Russia a long time, in the early 1900s, I wasn't oppressed. I mean, I wasn't oppressing anybody. My ancestors didn't own slaves. Why should I do it? Well, they say, it's because of the color of your skin. That because the color of your skin affords you certain privileges that basically makes you responsible for things like slavery. And I mean,
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and people are just absolutely brazen about it. And the racism on the other side. You see, when you can convince yourself that you are incapable of being a racist, that opens the door. It opens the floodgates for just the most virulent racism, the most toxic and insidious ideologies that will basically lead you to become a horrible person, that will basically lead you to become an oppressor. It will lead you to become the oppressor that you claim to hate.
Yes. Oh, it's such fictional nonsense. In the 1830s, there was a series of black tribal wars in South Africa in which the liberal sources claim that between 1/3 and 2/3 of every man, woman, and child were killed. Now, that's unknown. You may not be familiar with the statistics pertaining to wars and combat and that sort of thing. I can tell you that typically in European wars, something like 20% of the combatants die, and the number of civilians is negligible. Not always, but typically. For 1 or 2/3 of all of the tribes, the peoples, the races, the nations, the ethnic groups, the religions, you name it, to be killed, of all of them, not just one, not just pygmies or gypsies or Jews or whatever, of all parties to be killed is unheard of in history. And yet blacks will say that white people are so brutal, they're so cruel, they're so this, they're so that. But white people in their wildest imaginations have never prosecuted an oppression of black people, such as the example I've just given you. They're called the Mfecane Wars, Mfecane. And people can look it up. White people, I'm not saying whites are good, pure as the driven snow, entirely benevolent, flawless, faultless. I'm not saying that. But I am saying categorically, because it's a mathematical thing, and it is the mathematics of the left. I'm quoting liberal sources. White people in their wildest imaginations throughout history have never even contemplated the level of brutality that existed in those wars.
Right. You see,
we are not as bad as they make us out to be, Brett, and that's a fact.
Well, this is part of the insidiousness of intersectionality, is that they can make racial statements about you. They can say white devil and all this stuff, but you can't say that there is a difference between, that there's a difference between black folks and white folks in the sense that the industry has been by and large created by white folks, and that black folks have benefited that black folks have benefited from white industry, from industry that has been created by white people. They're allowed to make the racial judgments, and they're allowed to talk about the differences between the races. But the moment you do, you're just showing the world how oppressive and how racist you are. So much so that it has become normal to qualify certain statements about race for white folks, or if you're on the other side of the aisle, even, you have to qualify it. You have to say, well, I'm not racist, and I'm not saying that there's, I'm not saying that all white people, I'm not saying that all black people, but then on the other side, they can brazenly say, without any qualifications, without any sort of caveats, that white people are the devil. And they'll say in the same breath that you are the racist. How does that make any sense whatsoever?
Well, Brett, it's a bit like this cultural appropriation thing that we see on YouTube. It's not something I really watch, but it's something I have seen, this big debate in America about cultural appropriation. A black person wearing shoes designed by white people, styles of clothing that are to the marrow of their bones, as it were, white. I mean, they're not keffirs, and they're not jalabias, and they're not this, they're not that, they're not loincloths. Right. They're jeans and T-shirts wearing white deodorant, as opposed to, and I don't mean to be nasty, but I wish to make a point here. In the northwest of South Africa, very famously, some certain tribes, especially those across the border in Namibia called the Ovahimba, used to use as a deodorant poo. Ugh. Right? Ew. That was that's, so this black person can be wearing white sneakers, white jeans, white T-shirt, a white watch, white deodorant, a fashion, a style, a scent, going back thousands of years, and then tell a white person that they're bad because they've got dreadlocks. It's unbelievable, Brett.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely...
because it's cultural appropriation.
Right.
You're trying to steal my culture from me. You're trying to rob me of the very little bit that I have left.
Did you ever notice? Did you ever notice how when white people try to like put on a Shaquille O'Neal jersey or whatever, it's cultural appropriation. But then when white people try to segregate themselves and they try to do their own white thing, well, that's another form of racism. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's like the idea of gentrification versus white flight. If white people leave a dilapidated neighborhood, well, that's white flight. That's racism. But if a white person goes to a dilapidated neighborhood and turns it into like a prosperous economy, well, that's racist too. Because you are gentrifying a culturally black area, whereas before it would have been just the black culture was free to do what it wanted. Now white people are coming in and gentrifying the area, turning it into a white area. It's all racism. Yeah. Any way that you swing it, whether you're literally damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Yes.
How can my listeners get in touch with you so that they can figure out how that they can get involved and sort of keep an eye on this? Because we're not going to hear about this from the mainstream media. The mainstream media in both South Africa and in America and in Europe are going to say, well, it's just those whiny little white farmers, I mean, they're just butthurt that they're not going to have the power that they always had. They're just butthurt that they're not going to have the farm that their parents stole from these black people. They're totally minimizing this whole entire thing, and it's really, really difficult to get good information. Where can my listeners find you?
Brett, my email address is hk@suidlanders.co.za. hk@suidlanders.co.za. Our website, our English language website is suidlanders.org. That's SUID landers.org. And if people are interested in donating, we would be very grateful. We are desperately trying to raise $100,000 for a little diesel fuel fund. That's being facilitated by Freestarter. If they just search Freestarter with Google or Bing or whatever, they will see on the Freestarter homepage a campaign to help us to raise this $100,000 for a kind of a diesel stockpile in a very, very strategic area. I just want to say one thing. Last week I was pretty unavailable, and I've got a backlog of about 190 unread emails. And next week, from this weekend, I'm going to spend about a week reconnoitering safe havens for refugees in our forthcoming civil war on some mountains in a certain remote location in South Africa. So if anybody sends me an email today or tomorrow or the next day, or for that matter, for the next week, they should really be patient. It might take me a little while to get back to them. Please, it's most urgent that we go and reconnoiter these safe havens on the mountaintops, because without them, a very terrible onslaught could ensue.
And this is Brett Siegel. Obviously, this is Brett Siegel, the Disgruntled Millennial. You can get me at Facebook, the Disgruntled Millennial, or you can get me at Shaq General on Twitter. If you want to get in touch with Simon, I can help you to be a liaison. We are going to put his information down in the show notes so that you'll be able to just click on a link and an email box will pop up. I really, really hope that this is the kind of thing that we can nip in the bud right now. I think if we raise enough awareness about the things that are going on in South Africa, we can avoid a very similar thing, which really looks like it is going to happen at some point here in America. It looks like things are bubbling over to the point where, people are just, the racists in the country are getting more and more brazen. And I'm talking about the racists on both sides, and especially the left, because right now the left sort of owns the culture. It's totally, if you want to know who owns the culture, just try to figure out, if you want to know who has the real power, just decide who you're not allowed to, just figure out who you're not allowed to criticize. You're not allowed to criticize black folks. You're not allowed to criticize minorities. The way that people are on Facebook and on social media now is that they brazenly attack white people with absolute impunity. There's no indication that these people even feel the remotest bit of remorse or reluctance. A white person can't open his mouth about black person without saying, well, not all black people, not all white people. All sorts of disclaimers and caveats, but without the caveats, without the disclaimers, with absolute impunity, leftists are going around saying conservatives, whites are absolutely evil, all this stuff. So we know from this case that who you are not allowed to criticize, and it's the minorities in America, the majority in South Africa, and let's just hope that we can nip this in the bud before it gets too far out of hand. Simon Roche, I want to thank you so much for joining the show. And I remember last time we spoke on our last podcast, we were going to talk a little bit about the apartheid narrative versus the BDS narrative in Israel, because there's some really, really interesting sort of overlays that are going on. But we'll definitely leave that for another show. Also, I will put the first show that we did together in the show notes so that people can get a little bit more of an overview of the history of South Africa and the history of how the narrative has sort of been twisted and turned to create the climate that we have today. And again, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having Suidlanders back, Brett. It's much appreciated at this very, very dark time.
Hey now, this is Cowboy Jeff at Cowboy Jeff Sucks on Twitter. If you're not listening to the Disgruntled Millennial podcast, then you're probably wearing a burqa.